Yeah, I am made of their butter and you are worth 20k monies. Retronauts eats communism as it presents episode 57 of NES Works. A while back we looked at the first game to make use of Bandai's Power Pad accessory, Athletic World. At the time, I didn't have access to the accessory, and therefore couldn't properly demonstrate the game in action, since it's not compatible with the standard controller. Well, now I have that bad boy hooked up to my capture kit. And so... You're the best around, nothing's ever gonna bring you down. You're the best around, nothing's ever gonna bring you down. You're the best around. Alright, with that out of the way, we now arrive at our second title in the Family Fun Fitness series, and it's a doozy. This game has every bit as massive a legacy as Deadly Towers, though in a very different sense. Where Deadly Towers is a game no one wants to own, everyone wishes they had a copy of World Class Track Meet. Or rather, they wish they had a copy of its ultra-rare alternate version, Stadium Events. Originally released in Japan under the name Running Stadium, this game was issued in the US under two different titles. Stadium Events came first, followed nearly a year later by World Class Track Meet. There's no definitive story on the provenance behind this game's dual identity, but there's also no shortage of speculation. Stadium Events was released with Bandai as the publisher, while World Class Track Meet was published as a first-party title by Nintendo itself. In fact, Nintendo didn't simply publish World Class Track Meet, they made it a pillar of their NES business. In 1988, the company began bundling it with their deluxe console sets, which contained a system, controllers, zapper, power pad, and a triple game cartridge containing Super Mario Bros., Duck Hunt, and World Class Track Meet. The prevailing theory among collectors is that Bandai published a small run of Stadium Events before Nintendo swooped in and licensed the game in Power Pad for first-party release under a new name. There's no way to know if most Stadium Events carts were recalled and destroyed, or actually just allowed to sell through at retail. Collector Steve Lin, who owns one of the few known complete in-box copy of Stadium Events, speculates that Bandai simply produced the minimum quantity of copies of the game, probably a few thousand copies, and just let retailers sell it through. That would account for the fact that the cartridge can be found in the wild, but scarcely, while complete boxed versions are known to exist in single-digit quantities. Given how difficult it can be to find complete editions of a few other early NES games, including Bandai's own CHUBBY CHERUB, this would seem to track. Bandai probably didn't churn out many of these, especially since they were dependent on a peripheral sold separately, and the few people who actually picked up the game probably didn't feel particularly compelled to preserve their copies. And so, Stadium Events has become an NES holy grail, a game fervently sought by collectors. It first entered the mainstream consciousness back in 2010 when a copy sold for $13,000, and copies have subsequently sold for as much as $41,000. Of course, you could always just buy World Class Track Meet for a few bucks, as it's literally the same game. The only material difference between Stadium Events and World Class Track Meet is its title, otherwise they're exactly the same. And what you'll find in either version of the game isn't particularly inspiring. It's a sports game masquerading as a fitness program, but really it's just a flimsy excuse for a game that exists to justify a gimmicky peripheral. Stadium Events contains 4 different play modes, all of which involve running. And sometimes you jump. But that's about it. Just a series of quick, Olympic-style events that generate short bursts of exertion as players stomp on the power pad. The minigames last just long enough for players to get their hearts racing, but there's not really enough happening here to inspire players to replay the events for extended periods of time. We fit the saint. All modes use a common behind-the-shoulder format and basically amount to 2 variations apiece on 2 different competitions. There's a 100-meter dash and the 110-meter hurdles. And then there's the long jump and the triple jump. Bless their hearts, the developers at Human Entertainment at least tried to put a little pizzazz into the game. As players run forward, there's a bit of a horizon effect as the stadium scenery in the distance pans up into view, which is silly at this scale, of course, but at least an effort was made. In terms of actual things to do, though, Stadium Events definitely does not pack in $41,000 worth of content. The 100-meter dash simply sees you trying to outrace your competitor along a racetrack. The 110-meter hurdles is basically the same thing, except you also have to leap hurdles while you run. The jumping-only events, on the other hand, lack a direct competitor, setting the player's on-screen avatar to aim for the best distance alone. The long jump involves building up a head of steam by running, then taking a huge leap once you hit the jump line. You want to take off as close as possible to the jump line without going over, which takes a bit of finesse and practice. The triple jump is the same thing, except you need to perform a second leap the instant you touch down. And that's about it for stadium games. The game does offer 2 extended single-player competitions. First, there's tournament mode, in which you challenge a succession of AI competitors to either the 100-meter dash or 110-meter hurdles. You begin by racing a turtle, a race that is effectively impossible to lose, and you work your way through the ranks to take on a cheetah, a race that is effectively impossible to win. Sadly, these characters are other human racers, not the actual animals. There's also Olympics mode, which simply sees you play through all 4 racing events in succession. Otherwise, there's not much more to the game. Again, Stadium Events was reissued in August 1988 as World-Class Track Meet, a game that collectors regard as distinct from Stadium Events, but which for the purposes of NES Works is the same darn thing. Anyway, thanks to Steve Lin for providing access to the super rare packaging. While our other game this episode is also a multi-event sports title, boy is this one a stinker. Well, this version is anyway. Winter Games traces its origins back to the Commodore 64, where it entered the world as a follow-up to Epyx's insanely popular summer games. As the title suggests, it adapts elements of the Winter Olympics into video game form, just as Summer Games adapted the Summer Olympics. Epyx's original games titles were well received by critics and players alike, and they quickly made their way to every conceivable contemporary platform. If it was an 8-bit computer or console, and it was even slightly viable at retail between 1985 and 1988, it had a version of Winter Games. And of all of these, the NES version vies enthusiastically for the title of Worst. This is a game that showed up on vastly less capable platforms, including the Atari 2600 and ZX Spectrum. It's really quite a remarkable butchery of the original material, and we can thank developer Atelier Double for this botch job. We've seen Atelier Double's work a few times on Game Boy Works. They were, for example, the studio responsible for creating a conversion of Sokoban that somehow ran more sluggishly than it had on Epyx Game Pocket Computer 5 years earlier. By all accounts, Winter Games appears to have been the studio's first project ever. Well, technically, I suppose the NES version of Winter Games was their second project. This port originally debuted on Famicom Disk System in Japan, and was then reworked for this cartridge. So far as I can tell, though, there were no meaningful differences between the 2 releases, outside of the lengthier load times on diskette. As we've seen, Disk System games often had to be cut back for cartridge, and you might think that was the case here. After all, the NES version inexcusably cuts 3 of the 7 events featured in the computer edition of Winter Games. It would make sense if those levels had originally appeared on Disk System but didn't make the cut for a cart. But no, Atelier Double simply didn't bother bringing over all 7 events, period. And the ones they did bring barely work. Particularly egregious is the figure skating competition, in which you control a badly animated gazelle of a woman who can perform a handful of moves, including an axle jump, a camel jump, and a sitting spin. These are then scored by the computer according to a mysterious rubric that no one on the internet can seem to explain. Somewhat less opaque than the freeform figure skating is the hot dog ski jump event, in which players try to perform a few fancy maneuvers while in midair. It seems easier to score above a 2.0 in this event than it does in figure skating, though the outcomes are still needlessly arbitrary. Thankfully, speed skating is less nonsensical. It's just a race where you pump your little legs in a rhythm and try to outperform your opponent along a 400-meter course. Nice and simple. And finally, there's bobsled racing, which would be fine if Atelier Double had bothered to redesign it for NES. Unfortunately, the bobsled race gives away Winter Games' PC origins. The active racing view takes up about 10% of the screen. The rest of the windowed view mostly consists of a map, a hilariously oversized speed meter, and some pointless decoration. This might not be so pitiful if we hadn't already seen SLALOM, which offered full-screen winter racing with no compromises. All in all, this is an awful conversion of a perfectly decent PC game. It fails to retain all the content of the PC original, while also failing to take advantage of the NES hardware's capabilities. Frankly, it plays about as poorly as Deadly Towers, and unlike that game, it demonstrates zero ambition. This miserable, watered-down conversion is going to be kind of par for the course for bottom-tier NES releases going forward. The future of the NES is here, folks, and it sounds like a terrible bastardization of John Williams' Olympics theme. Next time on NES Works, more sports games, but thankfully, not horrible ones.